Chapter 35 of Captain Bill McDonald, Texas Ranger, A Story of Frontier Reform. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This is read by Daniel Grant Peterson, Captain Bill McDonald, Texas Ranger, A Story of Frontier Reform, by Albert Bigelow Paine. The Conduit Murder Mystery. A terrible crime at Edna, Texas. Monk Gibson's arrest and escape. The greatest manhunt in history. It was during the latter part of 1905 and the spring of 1906 that Ranger Captain McDonald was engaged in unraveling a mystery which gave the opportunity for employment of his natural talent for detective work, combined with the skills and experience acquired during a long period of following criminals and uncovering crime. On September 28, 1905, 2 miles from the little town of Edna, Jackson County, Texas, during the temporary absence of J.F. Conduit, employed in a rice harvest 7 miles distant, his wife and 4 young children, ranging from ages from a baby boy of 3 to a little girl of 12, were murdered in broad daylight. Their bodies left as if they had fallen in and about the premises. The murders were committed in the most brutal and bloody way, with knife, adze, and such household tool and implement as came to hand. 3 of the murdered children were boys. The little girl of 12 had been violated. One of an infant of a few months had been left alive. The story of that ghastly crime, its motive, its commission, its detection, and punishment for its perpetrators can only be epitomized here, for its details would fill the volume and belong only to official records. Neither are they yet complete. We shall attempt, therefore, no more than the outlines. With such particulars will show the scope and importance of Captain McDonald's work in solving a mystery and fixing the guilt, not only without the assistance of those most interested, but in the face of the bitter opposition. The Conduit family had but recently moved to Edna. They were working people, respectable but poor, and had taken a house formerly occupied by Negroes. This, then, itself was an offense to the immediate neighborhood, a Negro settlement. And when Mr. Conduit repaired his fences and thereby shut off from public use a windmill where the Negroes had been accustomed to go for water, his offense in their eyes became a crime. They did not want him there and resolved to get rid of him. How many or how few were concerned, directly and indirectly, in the conspiracy drive out or destroyed the white family that had settled among them, will perhaps never be known. That Negroes seldom betray one another, and that a Negro conspiracy was most difficult of all plots to illuminate, are facts only too well established by our recently recorded history. The Conduit murder plot furnishes an unusual example of this particular African phrase. The Negroes were swollen at first in their matter towards the Conduits. Then one of them, a certain Felix Powell, spoke insultingly to Mildred Conduit, a little girl of 12, then September 28th, 9 o'clock in the morning, the day hour of destruction. It was 1 o'clock in the afternoon before the crime had become known. Monk Gibson, a colored boy of 16 who had been plowing for Mr. Conduit in a field about 200 yards from the house, carried the news. He ran to the house of a white man named John Gibson, some distance away, and reported that he had just seen Miss Conduit had been chasing around in the house by 2 men. John Gibson went on the run to the Conduit premises, found no trace of the 2 men, but did find the murdered family, a house like a slaughtered pen. And in the midst of this horror, a wailing infant, Gibson, the white man, hurried the colored boy off to bring Mr. Conduit from the rice field, and set out to spread the alarm. In a brief time the country was aflame. Monk Gibson, returning with Mr. Conduit, was put under arrest, and it was now found that he was smeared and splashed with blood. He explained the stains with saying that his nose had bled and that he had hurt himself creeping through the wire fence, but there were no indications of his nose having bled, and he could show only a mere scratch of the wound. That he was concerned in the crime was never doubted, but only unreasoning them that believed he had conducted it alone. Questioned, he told conflicting stories, finally stating that men whom he did not know had dragged him to the house, compelled him to view their work, splashed him with blood, and set him free. Of course, these statements were not believed. The whole country round about Edna, now terribly aroused, was determined to have the truth. If Monk Gibson was alone in the crime, and there were many who soon reached this conclusion, his punishment would not wait the slow process of the law. If he were one of several, he must reveal the names of his associates. He was put through the severest ordeal examination, but he would utter nothing more than the confused, contradictory stories already told. Every method was tried to extort information, yet he only repeated his conflicting stories and refused to tell names. It was now pretty generally assumed that he had nothing to tell, that he alone had committed the crime. A lynching mob was forming, and report came from Bay City that 200 men had chartered a special train for Edna and were coming to destroy the boy murdered that night. Sheriff Egg of Edna and his deputies had resolved to remove the prisoner to a place of safety, and quietly arranged their plan. As soon as it was dark, they had swift horses taken to the back of the jail, one for Gibson and others for the officers who had accompanied him. Then quietly they got him out through a back window, mounted him, unfeathered, between two officers, and slipped away towards Hallettsville, where it was believed that he would be safe. They never reached Hallettsville. While galloping at full speed along an open road, they came to a curve. The officers had no thought that Gibson would try to escape, and he was riding free. But at the curve, Gibson did not turn. He kept straight on, drove his animal over a fence, and disappeared in the thick darkness. When the officers recovered themselves and made their way into the field, they found the horse he had been riding, but their prisoner had vanished. They came back to Edna crestfallen and discredited. The people at first declared that the deputies had put Gibson in hiding. Then, only half convinced and fiercely angry, they joined in what was perhaps the greatest manhunt ever known in Texas. Every available horse and gun was secured. Every available man was presently in the saddle. But this was only a beginning. Within a brief time, fresh carloads of horses were shipped to Edna. Ranchmen sent their cowboys. Every pack of bloodhounds in South Texas was mustered into the service. Commissary camps were established. Leaders were appointed for the various bands. Business was suspended. The country became one vast encampment, and all for the purpose of running down a single boy of 16 who had slipped away from the deputies, was believed to be hiding in the swamps. In the midst of all this, Governor Lanham ordered the Adjutant General Hulen with 4 companies of state troops to invest the place, whereupon Edna became a military camp in fact. Captain McDonald was working in another part of the state when he first saw the reports of the Conduit murder. His headquarters now being at Alice, the scene of the crime was in his territory, and before many days he was notified by General Hulen to report at Edna with men and bloodhounds to join in the search. Arriving at the front, he found such a turmoil of excitement and animosity of trouble of many kinds as is not often gathered by any one place. Men and groups of men, each more distracted than the other, were rushing hither and yon on 100 fruitless and many imaginary errands. Nobody was really doing anything. Everybody was blaming everybody else. Everybody was mad at the soldiers, mad at the arriving rangers, mad at each other. In the meantime, Monk Gibson was still at large. Captain McDonald looked over the ground as quietly as they would let him, and gave it out at his conclusion that no one man could have committed all that crime in open daylight, let alone a boy of 16. The sentiment was almost wholly in the other way by this time, and the ranger captain's opinion was bitterly opposed from the start. What the people wanted was a victim. If they could capture Monk Gibson, they would have a victim, and they did not want any complication that would interfere with his elementary proposal and the summary idea of justice which lay behind it. The presence of military and especially of rangers was a menace, and for Bill McDonald to try to confuse matters with his detective theories, which might result in Gibson going clear even if captured, would not be lightly borne. He was given to understand that the people of Edna knew what they wanted, and when they wanted rangers, they would invite them. Captain Bill, however, followed his own ideas. He felt sure that Gibson was only one of several that had perpetuated the crime, and was doubtless a tool of older men. Moreover, there were bloody handprints left by one or more convict murderers, and those he could not believe had been made by the hand of a boy of 16, small for his years, as Monk Gibson was declared to be. He further believed that Gibson was somewhere in the hiding near his home, for by long experience he had learned that the hunted Negro would always go home, regardless of risk. Meantime, Monk Gibson's parents were in jail, and their premises had been searched more than once. Other Negroes had been arrested on suspicion, only to be discharged for lack of any tangible evidence. Captain McDonald went on his way holding the theory that the Negro boy would be found in the neighborhood of his own home. His two bloodhounds, Trouble and Rock, he took there repeatedly to try to pick up the trail, yet always without success. He believed the boy would come home for food and into the nearby windmill for water. The barn near his father's house was searched daily, and while for some reason Captain Bill did not attend to this detail himself, he was assured each time that the search had been thorough. Yet Monk Gibson was hiding in that barn all the time. There are some unthrashed oats in the barn, and he had found a place that he could work himself under the straw, leaving no trace on the outside. Sometimes at night he had crept out to a pig pen for water and had picked some ears of corn in a nearby patch. One morning he could stand it no longer. He came out and called to a Negro named Warren Powell, whose brother Felix Powell, already mentioned, was to play an important part in this tragic drama. Warren Powell immediately took charge of the boy Monk, tied him, and notified the officers. General Hullen, Captain McDonald, Sheriff Egg, and others responded quickly, and putting the boy into a buggy made of wild gallop for a jail by a circuitous route to avoid the crowds. He landed safely inside, tossed from man to man between a line of bayonets, and when the infuriated populace gathered, they were driven back by a cordon of armed officials. Captain McDonald now got himself disliked in more ways than one. For one thing, he persisted that his theory that Monk Gibson alone could not have committed the crime. For another, he urged that Gibson would be taken to a safer, quieter place for protection. Furthermore, he would not permit them to obtain testimony from the prisoner by torture. Approaching a jail one night, he heard screams of agony. Entering, he found his assembly examiners in Monk Gibson's cell, where Gibson was tied up by the thumbs, the boy screaming, but refusing to tell anything more than conflicting incoherent stories told at first. "Take that boy down," said Captain Bill. "Don't you know that anything you get out of a witness is by torture is not evidence enough for a mob, let alone a court of law?" Meantime, the ranger captain had been picking up threads of evidence of his own. For one thing, he had observed that two Negroes, Felix Powell, already mentioned, and one Henry Howard, had taken a curiously intense interest of all the investigations, seemingly fascinated by every movement of the officers, especially of the rangers. He noticed, too, that certain other Negroes of the settlement were acting in a manner which, to one with a special knowledge of their characteristics, appeared suspicious. He made carefully guarded inquiries, and learned that while Powell and Howard claimed to have been working for a man named John Young all day on the day of the murder, they had in reality worked for Young only during that afternoon, when he spoke to them about their answers and contradictory. Finally, Powell acknowledged that he had not worked for Young during the forenoon, and could give no satisfactory account of his whereabouts for the morning. It was generally believed at first that the murder had been committed about 1 o'clock, the time of the alarm by Monk Gibson. But the condition of the bodies were found made by evident that the crime occurred much earlier. Captain McDonald believed that as early as 9 o'clock. McDonald finally questioned Powell directly, and believed he detected guilt in his every look and word. Powell denied knowing Monk Gibson at all, although the two had been raised in the same neighborhood. Gibson, on the other hand, had already acknowledged that he knew Powell and had always known him. Finally, Captain Bill said, "Well, Felix, I think I will put you in jail a while to refresh your memory." The suspect man nearly collapsed at this and protested his innocence. Searched, a knife was found on him, which had been rusty, inoffensive look on the outside, and according to its owner, was very dull and used only for cutting tobacco. But when this knife was opened, it was found to be razor-like sharpness, and when a match was passed through the jaws and blade recessed, the end of the match brought up blood. Two of the Conduit children had died of a ghastly knife wounds. Captain McDonald believed this knife had made them. Evidently, he was alone in that belief. The arrest of Powell was condemned generally as a diversion to aid in clearing Gibson, it being widely declared that such was the ranger captain's purpose. To this, however, he paid not much attention, his one desire being to get as much evidence as possible and bring the guilty to justice. He did not feel warranted in arresting Howard and the others at this time, though fully believing them concerned as accessories, if not as principals, in the plot to kill. That Monk Gibson had not been alone in the crime he was quite positive. The prints of the bloody hand mark sawed out of the Conduit house could not be made to fit Gibson's hand by any stretch or adjustment of that member. Neither did it look as if it would fit Powell's hand, though the actual fitting was not then tried. For Powell was wary, and must be entrapped into a task that would require such nicely of adjustment. But there had been one more suspicious circumstance. A shirt that had been found tucked away under a bridge over a creek where it had been washed, though it still bore evidence of bloodstains. Captain McDonald approached Powell with the shirt in a small bundle under his arm. "That's not my shirt!" declared Powell quickly. Before a word had been said, before it was possible to tell what the folded garment was. Yet the grand jury then in session refused to listen to McDonald's evidence, or indict any one but Gibson, who was charged by that body with the entire crime. By this time the soldiers had gone back to Austin, and only the rangers and local officers were in charge of the jail. When the indictment was found, Captain McDonald demanded that the prisoner to be removed to San Antonio for safety, and the district judge consented to the removal. Threats that such removal would not be permitted were plenty enough, but the rangers, without announcement or manifestation of any sort, made ready, and when the train was about due, quietly and swiftly hurried him to the station and put him aboard. He landed in San Antonio safely, and for the time of the Conduit case was questioned. Felix Powell was turned out of jail as soon as the rangers were gone, evidently as an affront to McDonald, and to show the community's disbelief in his theories as well as the general disapproval of his efforts. McDonald, with plenty of work crying to be done, was not eager to continue a thankless task, even though it was work of a kind he loved. That winter, when Gibson's trial was coming on in San Antonio, he urged the prosecutors to try him as one of several and not as one alone who had committed the crime. They would not listen to him, and they would not let him testify, declaring that his theories and so-called evidence would spoil their case. They tried Monk Gibson for the entire killing, and a rational jury naturally failed to convict, though Felix Powell and Henry Howard were brought from Edna as witnesses and did their best to aid the prosecution. The jury was divided, and Monk was taken back to jail. It was not until the spring of 1906 that Captain McDonald was once again actively concerned in the Conduit case. Early in this season, while attending the Stockmen's Convention at Dallas, he met prominent men from the South Texas districts and reviewed with them the story of the crime and progress that he had made, or rather had not been made, in convicting the guilty. He stated freely his theories concerning Powell, Howard, and other Negroes, and went over the details of his evidence. The stockmen began by opposing Captain Bill's theories, and ended by joining in a movement to have the state continue the investigation at Edna under his direction. They employed a young lawyer named Crawford to bring the matter before the governor, who agreed to reopen the investigation, but suggested that it be done by another man than McDonald for the reason that citizens of Edna were prejudiced against the ranger. The stockmen's answer to this was that unless McDonald could be sent, they would have nothing further to do with the matter. The governor agreed then, and Captain Bill made ready to go to Edna and remain there until he should succeed in establishing his theory or be ready to acknowledge himself baffled. End of chapter 35.